So we're going to go ahead and go through Module 2. I'm going to walk you through the journal and make some connections between Module 1 and Module 2's themes. So just like we did in Module 1, we'll be using the modified Venn diagram in order to outline our thoughts. And we're looking at the three major parts that Fierro gives us at the beginning of our text. And that's this idea that all of the humanities, so that could be visual, literary, or performing art, can be read and treated as text. And we frame that in the context, which is the philosophical, cultural, and historical background or environment. And we look for the subtext, which is these ideas about interpretations and inferences that give us meaning to what we're looking at. So we're moving through our kind of time periods now, and we're going to build on the foundation of Module 1. So Module 1, we looked at this transition from theism to deism. Module 2, we moved from deism into naturalism and naturalism into materialism. A couple of notes on terminology here. So naturalism can be a rather difficult term to wrap your head around, mostly because it's used differently in each of the humanities disciplines. So for instance, when we talk about naturalism in terms of the visual arts, so painting and sculpture, naturalism really is realistic representation. So in fact, a lot of people will often conflate naturalism and realism. Those are really different two things. Realism is actually a whole different movement. So naturalism is a realistic representation of the world around us. However, when you get to things like philosophy or literature, naturalism means something very different. So for instance, in philosophy, naturalism refers to this idea of how the natural world has a divine spirit or has divinity within it. When you get to literature, that can be even broken into more deeper things like romanticism or transcendentalism. So a lot of isms here, a lot of words and terminology that you're going to want to kind of separate out. So I highly recommend looking through the text, using the glossary, or using the other resources that I've posted to make sure that you have a good handle on all the different isms and how they refer to one another. So we begin Module 2 looking at Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin is obviously a very controversial figure in America and in our history. His works have been contested over and over again, and there's a lot of myth and misunderstanding when it comes to what his theories were. So a real brief recap of who Darwin was. Darwin was a naturalist, and he traveled the world, specifically in the Americas, South America, and the islands, and he was looking for ways of cataloging the natural world, right? So he was a collector, right? He collected leaves and flowers and herbs and bones and specimens of birds and small mammals and bugs and insects and arthropods. And so he basically just collected this massive group of life forms in order to try to understand how the natural world operates. Through his observations, and specifically through his study of finches, a small bird, he discovered that nature chooses how species will survive based on their adaptations. And so what he found was that when he was going through the Galapagos Islands, there were all these different finches on the different islands, yet they all shared a commonality. They were all the same kind of bird, but they had different shaped beaks, and those beaks were tailored to their environment, right? So some of them had large beaks in order to break nuts. Some of them had thin beaks in order to eat insects or draw out nectar from flowers or eat fruits. And so each finch, although very closely related, had changed. This was revolutionary for his time, because prior to Darwin, it was thought that all of the natural world stayed in a steady state, meaning that it really hadn't changed. Kind of a for instance, or a nice little tidbit is, when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to go travel the Americas and try to find a trade route from the east to the west coast, he expected them to find mammoths because they didn't believe in extinction yet. So he was waiting to see where the American mammoths were or the American mastodons were, because they didn't believe that the world changed in that way. So this idea that the world evolved or changed was very controversial for its time, but it was also incredibly revolutionary. It has great impact on all around the world. So this idea that species could change over time based on the conditions of the environment, right? This is natural selection. This is the theory that Darwin puts forward. Now, where it gets a lot of kind of muddiness, or where it gets sort of changed in our American history, specifically right post his writings, but also in today's day, is that people make the mistake of saying things like, well, there are apes and apes turned into humans, or monkeys turned into humans. So it's not a transformation, right? It's not like a butterfly from a caterpillar to a butterfly, right? Like, it is a long, painful kind of process as a response to the natural environment. So yes, there are apes today, right? There are gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans, and there are humans. So a lot of times people will say, well, if there are apes, why did they turn into humans? Those aren't the apes that did. Instead, you have to think about it in terms of ancestry. Humans share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. They share a common ancestor with gorillas, right? So a long time ago, there was a different kind of ape which splintered off into two different groups or several different groups. And from that, we people developed, and chimpanzees developed, and gorillas developed, right? We share a common ancestor that no longer exists. That's what natural selection means. If you look here, I've got this image, and it's got like a stack of photographs, and I really think this is a great way to explain this, right? This actually comes from a contemporary scientist, Richard Dawkins. And so what Dawkins proposes is that one of the reasons Americans struggle so much with the idea of evolution is that we don't understand how the transformation takes place. We don't understand how time works, right? And so the photographs, this kind of image, illustrates this. So here's his way of explaining it. If I were to take my photograph and then look at my parents' photograph, and then look at my grandparents' photograph, right? And I kind of stack them on top of each other, and I flip through, I would be able to see similarities, but certainly some differences between the way I look, the way my face structure is, the way my hair color is, my eye shape, my nose shape, my mouth, how my facial expression and my face structure could be compared to my parents. And you can look at both my parents and you'll see bits and pieces of both of them in me, right? Okay, well then, if you take my parents and you look at them to my grandparents, you see the same thing happen, right? Like, my mom looks like my grandfather and my grandmother, and my dad looks like my other grandmother and my other grandfather, okay? And there's some similarities now, and because I have both of them in me, I can see some kind of connection between my face and my grandparents' face, but it's not as close as my parents, right? I'm much more closely kind of related and look more closely to my parents. All right, if I go to my great-grandparents or my great-great-grandparents, again, I'm going to see some similarity here, but I'm also going to see greater differences, right? And if you keep going to great-great-great-great-grandparents, then you'll see even more differences. And if you go to your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, you'll see even more differences, right? And so as you continue to go through your kind of stacks of your family tree, you're going to see that although I have some similarities, I'm much different looking than those people. All right, now assume that you had the ability to take photographs for thousands of years or even millions of years, right? So we're going to play this kind of little thought experiment. Well, if you continue to stack parents to grandparents to great-grandparents, parents to grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, you can continue to stack more and more and more images, and by the time you get to the 100th or 1,000th or millionth image, you'll see maybe some tiny similarities, but they'll be very, very different, right? This is what Darwin proposed. Darwin proposed that we are similar to all of the living things on Earth, But as we are distantly related to some things and we're closely related to other things, the similarities and differences are much more apparent, right? So if you look at a gorilla or a chimpanzee's face, you can see the connection between us, right? If you look into a dog's face, you see some kind of similarities, right? Like similar face, similar eye structure, right? And you start looking at things like, maybe a rodent or a small mammal. Again, you can kind of see some similarities, right? Like, we have a similar skull still, a similar mouth, but like, we're obviously, our sizes are very different. And so you can, we have different body parts, right? So like, mice and squirrels and chipmunks have tails and we don't, right? So you can continue to do this, right? Okay, so go from mammals then to reptiles. Again, like, we're connected, but we're not, we don't see a huge connection to that, but, we have this similar 2 arms and 2 legs body plan, right? A skull on top of a vertebrae. Vertebrae creates a spine. So that's very similar to a reptile, okay? Keep going, a fish is laid out the same way, right? It has the limbs and a skull attached to vertebrae, but we're definitely seeing a lot of a different kind of looking creature. We're related to everything on Earth, right? We're related to trees and mollusks and snails and squids and, you name it, we're related. Anything that's alive, we share common DNA with. It's just not very apparent because there's a lot of photographs, for using that kind of thought experiment, there's a lot of photographs distancing us between, human beings and trees. But we still share, a large percentage of our DNA with a tree. That's what Darwin was saying, is that there's lots of tiny little changes that happen over time, and it looks like we're really different because of the amount of time that has passed. Millions of years have passed. That gives you a lot of chance to change in response to the environment, right? So a giraffe has a long neck in order to reach the top of the leaves. Whales return to the sea from the ground, which is why they still have fingers, but you don't really see them because they're kind of meshed into their flippers. Bats have hands, but they've turned into wings, right? So there's all these tiny changes and tiny steps, which leads to how we see the world today. All right, this was the theory. This was groundbreaking when it came out. And Darwin knew it was going to be very controversial. So he didn't even want to mention people. So in Origin of the Species, he doesn't actually talk about people yet. That's not until a much later book, The Descent of Man, where he talks about humans' connection to the apes. Because he knew if he came right out of the gate and said people have evolved from lower life forms, that would create a lot of problems. This theory that Darwin has created impacts the arts. So we see great impact in things like the literature and philosophy. We also see impacts in visual representation. And we look at things like even economic theory has an impact from Darwin. So the next theorist or next artist I'm going to talk about is Henry David Thoreau, who was highly influenced by Darwin, right? So if you're unfamiliar with Thoreau, he's a transcendental writer from America, and one of his big mantras, he and one of his friends Emerson, is that the natural world is divine, right? That beauty and godliness are in the natural world. They're synonyms, they're together, right? So in other words, like Mother Nature, the creator, and God are all the same thing. They're all the same force, right? And he believed that you could see God in the natural world around you, and that human beings had over time separated themselves from the natural world, and because of that, they felt disconnected from that divinity, right? So there's a couple of like really interesting ways he talks about this, right? So one of my favorites is when he speaks of the engine of creation. This comes directly from Darwin. So after Thoreau reads Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, he starts to see how that functions in the natural world. So this idea of the engine of creation is natural selection. What that means is that when Thoreau sees the world around him and all this beauty, that over time and through the conflict and through struggle, that's what gives rise to all the success around us. So, in other words, natural selection or Mother Nature is how God created the universe, or even better said, that is what God is. God is not just the creator, but God is creation. He also saw the unbroken harmony of the environment, right? This perfect balance where you would never have too many deer versus too many wolves in the natural world, right? If you have too many deer, they start to starve because they start to overeat, and then that population drops. Or if you have too many deer, more wolves move in order to hunt off and kind of bring the herd back to balance. But the wolves would never eat more than they need or kill more than they need, because that would actually be defeating, right? Like if they just start killing willy-nilly, they wouldn't have resources later. So there's always this perfect harmony of the herbivores and what they eat, like the plant life, and the carnivores, which eat the herbivores, and then even the decomposers, like funguses and viruses and arthropods and insects, who help break down dead carcasses and churn that back into the earth, which gives life to plants. So like this endless cycle really is inspiring to Thoreau. And so if you don't know about why Thoreau is famous, is because when he wrote Walden, he did this kind of experiment. What he did was he decided that he was going to move up north, kind of abandon civilization, and just try to live off the land in a very simple way. Thoreau believes that human beings, but specifically Americans, have overcomplicated their life and had forgotten the true beauty of the world. So he kind of goes up, lives in this cabin. This cabin actually is owned by his friend Emerson, who's also a writer. And then he writes his kind of like mantra, or his like most famous work, which is Walden, where he lives off Walden's Pond. And he just spends a few years up there living a very simple, kind of harmonious life. And he kind of goes through a lot of spiritual kind of finding of himself, and he sees spirit and divinity in the natural world through the seasons changing, through the ecosystems. He actually starts kind of collecting a lot of samples and things, sort of like Darwin did. And so there's a lot of, you can really see a lot of debt to Darwin from Thoreau in his writing, right? So this is now taking it in more of like a spiritual or a poetic way, but this idea that the natural world is this harmony or is this beauty, it's intended to show that natural selection creates that, right? This idea that things adapt to their environment. That's what's beautiful. That's what's miraculous. So another a writer who was influenced by Darwin is Karl Marx. So just like Darwin, Marx has a very controversial history here in our country. Specifically, this idea that Marxism or communism or socialism are almost like taboo or kind of like dirty words in America because of their antithesis to capitalism. So Marx is influenced by many, many different people, right? Like he's a philosopher. He's kind of the father of sociology and social theory and conflict theory. And, he's inspired by Kant and Hegel from the philosophical tradition, but he's also highly influenced by Darwin. So he actually says that Darwin's idea of natural selection explains what's wrong with our economic theories, right? Especially the way we kind of organize our world. So I want you to be careful here, right? Like a lot of people will say, you hear the name Marx, and that's like a dirty word, and that something bad is going to be said then, right? Like something evil or something wrong is going to be, kind of expressed. We should be adamantly opposed to that idea that somehow learning a philosophy or learning an idea is toxic for you. Knowledge doesn't hurt you. It's how we use that knowledge that can be problematic. So what I want you to do is I want you to kind of suspend those kind of ideas about how negative Marxism is and just be open to what the ideas are. That doesn't mean you have to believe them. That doesn't mean you have to share them or vote that way or any way whatsoever. You're just trying to know what Marx said and understand his philosophy and how he got there, right? this idea that somehow that when we share a philosophy, it could hurt you, that's silly, right? And that's actually people who don't really know the philosophy, who haven't really understood it. It is much more important to, be critical and make those decisions for yourself. So this isn't an economic class, and this is not a historical class. So I'm going to give you just a brief overview of Marx, but I'm going to also warn you that it's a very nuanced theory, right? And really, what Marx was saying was that there are a couple of forces that kind of operate in human society, and really those forces kind of started when we shifted from tribalism to feudalism, where we started to organize society in a much more structured way. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the outcome of doing so is that how resources are used. And from Marx's study, he finds that really there's two kind of major players in economic thought. The first one of those is the proletariat, which are basically the laborers, and then the bourgeois, who are the people who make money off laborers, right? And then he saw that there was a big disconnect between the labor and its output, right? So like the person who works in a factory and making something is disconnected from what they made. And he blames industrialism as being the largest kind of factor which creates more alienation, right? So he kind of goes through this theory where he says, like, okay, if you were a blacksmith in the feudal area, you were a little bit removed from your labor, but you were still connected to your final product, right? So you probably didn't mine like the iron ore, or you probably didn't, feed yourself. You probably relied on other people to provide food and sustenance for you and your family, but you still made something that you controlled, right? Like if you made a horseshoe or a hammer or a sword, like that was made by your hand and you were connected to that. That craft and the craftsmen were intimately connected. He argues that in the industrial period, that the laborer becomes alienated from the output. So if you work in a factory, you don't actually make anything, you make a part of something. And because it takes so many people to make the thing, that you don't even have the skill to make it, right? So if you want to make a car, for instance, and you only worked on doors, or you only worked on engines, or you only worked on a part of an engine, or a part of a transmission, or all these things, right? You're so disconnected from the final product that you can't actually make the whole thing. You can only make the tiny piece that you're responsible for. He argues that what happens is when we do that, labor actually gets less valued, right? The blacksmith has great value because he knows how to make the whole thing. He knows how to make the whole sword or the whole hammer. If you don't have the blacksmith, you can't have one of those objects, right? The blacksmith is the only way you can get a sword. That isn't true for factory work. Factory work, because it becomes so compartmentalized, allows you to just fire people and replace them. They're very replaceable, right? And we can see that in modern day. Modern day, most people are very, very replaceable. Even if you're highly trained, we can kind of fire you and put someone else in there and train you up in a couple of weeks, right? A lot of training programs take no more than a month, right? That's not the past, right? If you look at like a blacksmith, it took that person, a decade of apprenticeship in order to know how to be a blacksmith, right? That is not what happens in modern day. We have some skill, but at the end of the day, only a few kind of pathways really still have that deep connection from output and product. So Marx argues that because of this system, capitalism takes advantage or exploits the laborer, right? The laborer doesn't get to make as much because the investor or the bourgeois class or the capitalist, because they have to take a piece of the pie, the laborer gets less. And as history, according to Marx, has shown, the laborer gets less and less and less, and the capitalist or the bourgeois continue to get more and more and more. One way I like to look at this and try to kind of see it is this illustration that comes out of the early 1900s here in America. It's actually based on a Russian illustration. Now, Marx didn't make this illustration, and he did not do this, right? Marx actually died before this illustration was created. But it's a nice kind of like way to show how Marx's theory kind of works out. It's not pure Marxism, so there's other things that are kind of added to it, but it gives you kind of the basis. And you'll see it shows this kind of hierarchy, right? This pyramid. And at the top of this pyramid, there's the capitalist, the bourgeois. That's the person who doesn't do the labor but has the money to invest in the labor, right? And he argued, part of this argument is that the bourgeois are the ruling class, right? They may not be the president or the senator or the king or the prince or the duke, but because they have enough money, they are on par with those people and they can create a lot of influence. Like this illustration, Marx was rather critical of religion. That's, I think, why a lot of times Americans have a problem with Marx. Marx saw that religion could be used, especially when it's in conjunction with wealth, to manipulate people, right? And so you'll see that this, the next kind of tier here is the religious orders. And that's because if you remember back to our first conference, we talked about this, most power in the world also derived that power from religious authority, not just political or economic authority. Then this illustration shows sort of the soldier class, and that's the class that defends what the bourgeois want, because the bourgeois are taking so much wealth, they need another class of people to ensure that they're not overthrown by a revolution. And so they employ a soldier class. And that soldier class could be actual soldiers, or it could be like the police force, or it could be managers, right? There's a lot of ways of looking at how enforcement takes place. And then lastly, at the bottom of this pyramid, you have the people doing all the labor, right? The people who make the food and who make the products and allow society to function. So this isn't Marx exactly, but it's pretty close. It's a nice illustration to show you what Marx was saying. Right? Marx also thought that if you applied knowledge to this, we could overcome this system. He thought, like Darwin, he said, this is kind of a natural system. It's a system that kind of naturally evolved over time. Just like a giraffe naturally evolved a long neck to eat the top of the leaves, the capitalist system was a natural way to help create order in a rather chaotic kind of world. But because people have reason and logic and rationality, we don't have to live with our natural instincts. In fact, we do a lot of things to overcome our natural instincts, right? Like our natural instincts to, if you want something, you just take it, right? Sharing isn't natural. We have to teach that often, right? Our natural instinct is to hate different groups. We have to teach and overcome that. So Marx said we can overcome the natural instinct to make, the bourgeois class and the proletariat class have conflict. He also argued kind of the opposite of that, which is that if you look at like tribal societies, which is a little bit more natural in the sense that like they're smaller, they often are related to family groups. He argued that those systems work a lot better because people are still connected to their labor, right? They're still connected to their value. So either side of the coin, Marx is arguing we can change our economic system, and he's invoking Darwin to get there. He's saying that we can evolve to the next step. And so he argues that a tribal society becomes feudalist, a feudalist society becomes capitalist, a capitalist society becomes socialist, and a socialist society could become communist. Communist was his argue of the best society. Because what is a communism? But it's a utopia, right? Communism is this idea that no one person is valued more than anybody else. Everybody has all the needs and resources met, and there's a lot of balance and harmony in the natural world, or in that kind of world, right? So it almost sounds like Thoreau, it almost sounds like Darwin, that you keep everything in balance and no one person monopolizes the resources. So he argued that socialism was the step between capitalism and communism. So a lot of times you'll hear in our day and age, people say, well, those are the same thing. They're absolutely not, right? They're very different kinds of systems with very different kind of tiers. And then people say, well, if you look at China or you look at Soviet Russia, communism failed. Well, truly, those weren't communist systems either, right? They were really more based on a feudalism than they were a communism. Right? We have not actually seen a true communist country. It's only theoretical. It's only hypothetical, right? So again, when people, in America are very anti-communist, they're anti what we've seen people call communism. I don't know if they're actually understanding the true meaning of what that word means, right? And so we have to be careful between the terminology and what people or popular culture says. Okay, then the last groups of people I want to talk about who were highly influenced by Darwin are painters, and specifically Impressionism and PostImpressionism. So there's always a natural connection between the arts and sciences, right? As science advances technology and advances material and things, then the arts are a reflection of that. Okay? We're actually going to talk about this again in another a lecture where I'll discuss with you the influence of mathematics on the arts. But for this this lecture, we'll be looking at specifically Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Okay, so what is Impressionism? So Impressionism is an offshoot or kind of an evolution of Naturalism in painting. Naturalist painters had this notion that they were trying to portray reality as people actually see it. So here's the thing, right? Prior to the 1800s or prior to the naturalism movements, right, everything was sort of painted in a more idealistic way. It was rooted in mythology, like the Greek and Roman gods, or rooted in religion, like Christianity, right, representing Old Testament and New Testament stories, right? So, and everything was kind of like idealized, right? Like you wouldn't see a very realistic representation of someone. You might see them, you know, represented in these really like idyllic ways, right? Like beautiful landscapes where everybody is nude and you know, shown with like golden light or wings or halos, and right, like this isn't natural. This is very idealized. So the naturalists said, well, we're going to try to represent the real world. So we'll look at things like, you know, landscapes and actually go out in the landscape and paint what we see, as opposed to you know, doing some sketches and then bringing those back to the studio and trying to kind of romanticize or kind of make this perfect landscape of perfect trees, perfect brooks and lakes and rivers. Like instead, paint what you actually see out there. And this was actually a very novel idea, where the painters would go out and sit in the landscape they were painting and do the painting right there and then. Now here's where technology and science afford this. Prior to that, it would have been too cumbersome because you would have to mix all your paints and pigments, and you would have to stretch your own canvases, and you had to build all the materials you needed to create the artwork. You can't do that in the landscape and then paint the landscape. But by the mid 1800s to late 1800s, we see an advancement in painting technology. We actually see pre-mixed paints being sold in tin tubes, sort of like old toothpaste tubes, right? That is a revolutionary way of you know, advancing art. And so the naturalists go out and paint in what's called plein air, where they paint in the landscape. Well, the Impressionists then are an offshoot of them, and they argue that the naturalists were wrong. The naturalists said that they were trying to paint what you actually see in the real world, but that isn't how people still don't see, right? There's more things that we're kind of that we're aware of, we see in a real three-dimensional way, and the picture plane is very flat. And so they argue that the naturalists took it the wrong direction, and they don't actually represent things in a real way. There's another influence here, and that's the camera. The camera is now taken hold in the world, and photographs represent things in a very like specific, realistic way that mirrors what reality looks like. And so the Impressionists also argue, what's the point of painting something very realistically when the photograph is always going to be better no matter what you do? So you might as well try to capture things that the camera can't capture. That includes things like color, light, and three-dimensionality. But it also includes things like feelings and emotions and ideas. So the Impressionists start to go out using a lot of the naturalist techniques, going out in the landscape, painting, kind of seeing the natural world around them. But instead of trying to capture the very specific lines or shapes of things, they go out and try to capture things like how light and color play off each other. And when they do that, they get these kind of like blurry, almost soft images. And one of the fathers of Impressionism, Claude Monet, he paints, you know, these really like beautiful but blurry kind of soft images. And when he and a lot of the other Impressionists start to show their work, critics actually make fun of them. They mock them. They're like, these aren't good. Like, these aren't very realistic. These are bad painters. And so they call it Impressionism because it's an impression of a good work. It's not a real work, right? And so that was actually a derogatory term. It was insult to call it impressionist, but the impressionist group, right? So Monet, Degas, Renoir, these guys, they embrace it. They say, fine, you want to mock us? We'll take it. And so today, Impressionism is one of the most popular and most powerful art forms that we have, right? The Art Institute in Chicago here has an amazing collection of Impressionist works. And, you know, the Impressionists themselves are sometimes the most sought after works in the world. But at the time, that was not the case. So there are a handful of Impressionists who are working in different styles, and they're all trying to figure out, how do we represent what the eye actually sees? Not what we fake with photography, not what we fake with what we say is realistic, but really how the eye works, right? The eye isn't always very clear, images are blurry, things are moving. Like, how do we capture all this? And so the Impressionists start to work on different ways of trying to capture movement and emotion in their work. Now, there are a few people who are called post-impressionists who actually showed their work with the Impressionists, but they kind of weren't in the club. The most famous of those is Van Gogh, right? So Van Gogh is this incredibly famous artist. He was showing with the Impressionists, but he actually didn't get to be called an Impressionist. We actually call him a post-impressionist, which is interesting because the post-impressionist period overlaps with the Impressionists, and some Impressionists are sometimes called post-impressionists based on their type of work. So it's a little confusing. So try to keep that sorted as you're thinking through these thoughts. So as I promised, I wanted to talk to you about how these artists were also influenced by Darwin, right? So I've got three that I'm showing here from the post-impressionists and an overlap between. So that's Degas, Cézanne, and Gauguin. Okay. So Degas actually blends both. He's considered an impressionist, and he becomes a post-impressionist at the end of his career. Cézanne shows with the impressionists, but he's often considered a post-impressionist, as is Gauguin, right? And the three of them, we think, were pretty influenced by Darwin to differing degrees. Degas very much so, and Cézanne, we make some kind of leaps trying to piece things together, and then Gauguin sort of in the middle. So after Degas reads Origin of the Species, and then learns a little bit more about Darwinian theory, he starts to see this kind of connection of showing how faces can give you the understanding of evolution, right? How a face moves and changes through time shows you connections, right? So, you know, if you look at a gorilla and their facial expressions, they're very similar to human ones. You look at a chimpanzee, they're even more similar to us, right? If you look at a monkey, like a rhesus monkey, or you know, even a baboon, they have very similar facial structures and facial expressions that we do. But even things like dogs and things like that have similar structures, right? Like you can kind of see when a dog is sad versus when they're happy, and these emotions are connected to facial. So Degas is really interested in this, right? And so he becomes so interested in this, he stops painting, you know, the more traditional kind of impressionist subject matters, and he does things like he gets admitted into courtrooms where people are on murder trials, and he paints their faces, and he does chalk studies and pastel studies of their faces. And he makes this connection, which we now know is kind of bad science, but he starts to look to see, do these people who are criminals, especially murderers, do they have more animalistic sort of facial expressions, right? So he's trying to look to see, do they look more like an ape or more like a, you know, a canine or something, as opposed to looking like, you know, a human being. He also goes to like places like cabarets and nightclubs and starts, you know, doing chalk drawings and studies of like singers who are full of like this intense emotion as they're trying to sing, and he's studying how their faces are kind of contorted and trying to see, like, are they more animalistic? And then he does a lot of these nudes, and he even says that, like, when he studies these nudes of, you know, women bathing and children bathing, he's doing so because nudity is this very primal, almost primitive way of living. And he's trying to see, like, what's the connection between the animal world and the human world in these very vulnerable kind of positions, right? And so you can see I have a selection of those kinds of works, those stories of Degas really trying to, you know, look at how Darwin's theory influenced us. And I've got this great quote by him. So Degas says, art is not what you see, it's but what you make others see, right? That's such an impressionist kind of way of thinking, that the painting plane or the painting surface isn't about trying to photographically mirror what you see in reality. It's trying to show that reality is more nuanced. There's all these other layers to it as opposed to just exactly what you see. But a tree isn't just a tree. A tree is life. A tree is seasonal. A tree is changing. How do you capture that in the painting surface? Okay, so that's Degas. Cezanne, we don't know this for like exactly, did he read Origin of Species and then become inspired that? We know he read Origin of Species. We know that he was highly influenced by geology, and we make some connections between some of his painting, especially kind of some of his obsessions, and geology and then fossils. So Cezanne said that when he like goes out and tries to paint these mountainscapes, and he becomes kind of obsessed with these mountains in this part of France where he's painting, which were really noted for kind of showing the different stratifications of geology. So you can see all the different eras of history. And you can see all these great fossil finds in there. So what he said was that he was going to reconstruct each of those layers in order to give you a better understanding of what the mountain really looks like. So a lot of ways, Cezanne's like a geologist. He's going through, like the different periods in history, like the Mesozoic era and the Eocene and all these things. Right? He's trying to build the mountain on the painting plane, and he's adding layers on top of it to try to give you a sense of what the mountain really is. And so it's this really like almost like scientific way of approaching painting, but yet he's kind of crude in his brushstrokes, right? If you look at his works, they're very blurry and they're filled with light. And part of that's because he's building an entire layer, entire geological layer, a strip of land, and then he's putting another one on top of it. And so his picture plane gets really muddy. And so he never like really is satisfied with it. And so he continues to go back and paint and paint and paint, trying to really capture like the fossilization of that era, right? And then how do you capture like the geological structure of it and then convey that in a two-dimensional surface? So, again, kind of building this up. And geology and biology come together for Darwin, right? That's how Darwin actually starts to explain natural processes over time. He's like, okay, well, if you look at the fossil record, you can see that species have changed over time and they become different species. And so we see that kind of language when Cezanne's talking about how he creates a mountain. He's showing the different eras or different evolution of that mountain over its history. He's trying to capture the size and majesty of that in his work. Then the last painter I wanted to talk about was Gogh. So Gogh is kind of inspired by Darwin to kind of do the same thing that Darwin did, right? Darwin goes out on the voyage of the Beagle, and he goes around and travels the world looking for specimens. So Gogh does the same thing. There's a lot of history with Gogh. I mean, he was a very wealthy man, but he abandons his family, and he was a roommate of Van Gogh, and they were kind of in a rough, terrible relationship. So there's some personal things about Gogh that we typically, you kind of have to overlook in order to try to understand a lot of his work, because he abandons his family and he goes on these voyages. And what he's really doing is he's trying to find like a primitive, simple society. Now, we would not use that terminology today, but that is what Gauguin's saying. And so he ends up in Tahiti, this very like what he calls a very primordial, kind of primeval forest land that hasn't been touched by Western civilization yet. And he thinks this is kind of the proof of Darwin. Now, this is where Darwin can be bastardized, right? Like really be kind of manipulated. Because Darwin didn't say this, and we actually don't think this way anymore at all. That like we don't think that human species evolve in this way. But Gauguin was showing that, look, I'm in Tahiti, and these people live very primitive lifestyles. This is evidence that they haven't evolved yet. In any event, like I said, we don't say it that way. There's a lot of reasons for that. But that was what Gauguin was thinking. And in this one painting right here, you'll see I've got kind of like different selections from it. He's trying to represent that like very like primal way that human beings kind of live. Gauguin actually ends up staying here, and and the titles of a lot of his paintings actually come straight from Darwin or influenced by Darwin's. writings, and he ends up staying in the islands for a while. There's a lot of like bad history with him. So I mean, like I said, I get past a lot of those social issues with Gogh. I mean, he ends up marrying a 13 or 14-year-old girl, giving her syphilis, abandoning her on the island. Not a great guy. But we can see the influence of Darwin on Gauguin's kind of thinking and his process. And we can see that intersection of art and science. All right, so what we've just done is we're showing the shift from deism to naturalism, right? So if you remember deism from module 1, we're looking at how people are trying to understand divinity and the sacred and God in a different way that isn't just scripture and isn't just from like a construct like a church, right? How can we understand the spirituality of the world without having to refer back to things that people have decided probably aren't true? Now, again, this is not a judgment on that. This is what they said, right? So if you believe differently, by all means, of course, you're entitled and encouraged to have those beliefs. This is just how they talk about it, right? That shift from deism to naturalism. That's how Darwin starts to speak about it. That's how Gogh, Gauguin, Thoreau, Marx, how they all speak about this as this kind of shift in the way of thinking about divinity. So as you're trying to put all these ideas into our Venn diagram and then use that to write your journal and understand like module 2, this is how I would envision it, right? So the context of really this idea of origin of species and really this shift from deism to naturalism, right? That the natural world is made up of a natural force, a creation force, a creator force, what Thoreau calls the engine of creation. And that Mother Nature operates and creates through natural selection. Species respond and adapt to the environment, and those that survive go on to make their offspring, and those that don't survive go extinct and no longer live, right? So the idea here is that time and change in the environment creates the opportunity and the need for new species. Okay, and like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, that's a very revolutionary idea, right? It's incredibly groundbreaking. Now today we don't tend to think of it that way, but at the time it was flipping the entire script on its end. Like no one had thought that before, in the same sense that Darwin really presents this, and a lot of the geologists who are kind of working at the same time with Darwin. Okay, so this is the context. This is the framing of it, right? This idea that things change through history and through natural history, from Mother Nature kind of presenting environments that require species to adapt. Then the subtext of that we can pull from Thoreau, especially through Transcendentalism and Walden, in that there's maybe something spiritual or transcendental or something greater and superior to humankind, right? And that force of nature, right, acts upon the world, and we can derive meaning from that and understand deep, true beauty from that. And that if we would try to live in a more balanced way, like Thoreau did when he kind of went up to that cabin and try to live off the land in a more natural and simple way, that we have room then in our world and our view to understand beauty in a much more real way. We see that played out then in actual kind of tangible ways, both through Marx's understanding of natural history and class struggle, and then the painters out of the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist eras, right? And that interaction of art and science, right? So the actual text, so the things that we could study, we could say, well, how did Marx get his ideas, right? Or how do the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists get their ideas? We can say, well, it comes from these kinds of interpretations of Darwin in the human sphere, right? How does natural selection and Mother Nature and transcendentalism impact the human experience? We can look to Thoreau for a spiritual or divine way. We can look to Darwin for a practical or scientific way. And we can see how that plays out historically and economically through Marx, and then through expression of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Now, I recognize that these are rather complicated ideas that you may need to kind of refer back to this lecture a few times to really grapple with them. Certainly, the required studies and the multimedia that I provided in the module are there to help explain some of these ideas. But what we're also looking at is how is naturalism, this foundation at the beginning of the 20th century, and really kind of the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, how does that help frame and create modernism? So in the next lecture, you're going to see modernism is really because of naturalism. And naturalism is really a shift from theism to deism into a more even more robust way, or more definitive way, right? So that's our path. Okay, so to recap, you're looking at the context of Darwin and Origin of the Species and how change kind of frames the world. How Thoreau looks at that same world and sees that change as part of the natural beauty and the harmony of the world. How Marx argues kind of from both sides of the coin that we could return to a more naturalistic and fair kind of share state, or we can use our intellect and overcome all the class struggles that we've created artificially. And then we can see it all played out in the expression and the creative expression and aesthetic expression of the arts, and how the arts were kind of influenced by these scientific ideas. All right, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this lecture with me. If you've got questions or comments, by all means, you can leave them in the YouTube channel or send me an email. If you do, let me know, and good luck on creating your journal.